The sun has barely risen. A small group of ancient humans stands at the edge of a vast open plain. Behind them lies the only place they've ever called home. Ahead stretches hundreds of miles of unfamiliar land, towering mountains, dense forests, roaring rivers, and predators they've never encountered before. They carry no maps, no roads guide their way, and no one waits to rescue them if they take a wrong turn. One mistake could mean starvation. Another could lead them straight into danger. Yet, without hesitation, they begin walking. Imagine standing among them. Every hill hides the unknown. Every horizon promises both opportunity and risk. The strange part is that this wasn't a one-time journey. Again and again, ancient humans left familiar territory and somehow reached places separated by deserts, frozen landscapes, and even stretches of open water. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would uncover traces of these incredible migrations in places that should have been almost impossible to reach. But each discovery only raised a more puzzling question. How did they know where to go? At first, the answer seems obvious. Maybe they simply followed animals in search of food, moving a little farther each season until entire continents were crossed. It sounds reasonable. In fact, for a long time, many believed the mystery ended there. But then researchers began uncovering evidence that didn't fit that explanation at all. Some ancient journeys appeared far too deliberate, far too ambitious, and far too successful to be explained by wandering alone. So if early humans weren't just drifting across the world by chance, what invisible guide was leading them into the unknown? The simplest explanation begins with survival. Ancient humans didn't travel because they wanted adventure. They traveled because staying in one place could become more dangerous than leaving it. As seasons changed, rivers dried up, herds disappeared, and edible plants became scarce. If food moved, people had little choice but to move with it. Generation after generation, these small journeys could slowly add up to astonishing distances. At first, the evidence seems to support this idea. Archaeologists have found ancient campsites stretching across vast regions, many located along the same routes once used by migrating animals. Stone tools, butchered bones, and abandoned fire pits appear like breadcrumbs scattered across the landscape, suggesting that humans repeatedly followed the paths of mammoths, bison, antelope, and other large prey. Instead of wandering aimlessly, they appeared to shadow the animals that kept them alive. Even today, hunter-gatherer communities offer similar clues. Many still adjust their movements with the changing seasons, returning to familiar watering holes, valleys, or forests year after year. It seems like a strategy as old as humanity itself. Follow the food, and the food leads you forward. For a long time, that explanation satisfied researchers. It was practical, logical, and easy to imagine. If every generation pushed only a little farther than the last, perhaps humanity spread across the globe was simply the result of countless small steps. But then, a few discoveries began to complicate the story. Some ancient settlements appeared in places where no migrating herds could have guided them. Others suggested people had crossed enormous deserts, rugged mountain ranges, and even open stretches of water. Those weren't accidental detours. If following animals explained most journeys, who or what guided humans when there were no tracks left to follow? For decades, one assumption shaped almost every explanation of ancient travel. Early humans simply explored whatever lay directly in front of them. The world was thought to have been discovered by accident, one valley, one river, and one mountain at a time. According to this view, there was no grand plan, just endless wandering driven by necessity. But the evidence began telling a different story. Researchers noticed that some of the oldest human settlements weren't randomly scattered across the landscape. Many appeared in remarkably strategic locations, near reliable freshwater, natural mountain passes, sheltered coastlines, or areas rich in valuable stone for making tools. Even more surprising, groups separated by hundreds of miles sometimes used the same rare materials, suggesting that objects, ideas, or people had traveled far beyond what anyone expected. Think about that for a second. If communities were exchanging resources over such enormous distances, they had to know those distant places existed in the first place. That doesn't sound like blind wandering. It sounds like knowledge being shared across generations. Then came an even stranger clue. Archaeologists uncovered evidence that certain ancient groups repeatedly returned to the exact same locations, sometimes centuries apart. These weren't permanent cities, yet people somehow remembered where they were, how to reach them, and why they mattered. The routes seemed almost invisible, passed from one generation to the next without maps, writing, or signposts. That discovery challenged a long-held belief. Perhaps ancient humans weren't simply reacting to the landscape, they were building detailed mental maps of it. Stories told around campfires, recognizable landmarks, the position of rivers, distant mountains, and even the stars may have formed a living navigation system carried entirely in human memory. It was an extraordinary possibility, but if memory alone guided people across unfamiliar worlds, one question became impossible to ignore. How could anyone remember a journey they had never personally made? That question eventually led researchers to investigate something they had long overlooked. What if the greatest navigation tool ancient humans possessed wasn't hidden in the landscape at all, but inside the human mind? To find out, scientists began studying modern indigenous communities whose traditions still preserve remarkably old ways of traveling. They expected to see people relying mostly on obvious landmarks like rivers, mountains, or coastlines. Those clues certainly mattered. But they weren't the whole story. As researchers spent more time observing these communities, a fascinating pattern emerged. Experienced travelers weren't just remembering directions, they were remembering stories. Every hill, unusual rock, bend in a river, or lone tree became part of a larger narrative. Instead of memorizing a list of turns, they carried entire landscapes inside carefully crafted tales, songs, and oral traditions. Each story acted like a chain, linking one landmark to the next until an incredibly long journey could be recalled with astonishing accuracy. The discovery surprised many researchers because it revealed that memory becomes far stronger when information is woven into a meaningful story rather than stored as isolated facts. Suddenly, ancient migrations looked less like random exploration and more like knowledge carefully preserved across generations. The implications were enormous. A child listening beside a campfire might not simply be hearing an entertaining tale. They could be learning the safest river crossing, the location of distant water sources, or the route through dangerous mountains without realizing they were memorizing a map. Imagine that. Entire travel guides carried not on paper but in human memory. Yet another mystery remained. Stories can preserve a route already known, but they cannot explain how the very first explorers crossed landscapes no one in their community had ever seen before. So what gave those first travelers the confidence to keep walking into the unknown? One of the most remarkable clues comes from a people who left no written records, no cities, and no monuments, yet accomplished something that still amazes researchers today. Thousands of years ago, the ancestors of Australia's Aboriginal peoples reached a continent completely separated from mainland Asia by open water. However short those sea crossings may have been, they could not have happened by accident. Picture a small group standing on a distant shoreline. Across the horizon, another land is barely visible, or perhaps not visible at all. No compass points the way. No detailed map exists. The ocean hides everything beyond its surface. Choosing to step onto a simple raft or wooden craft wasn't just a journey. It was a leap into uncertainty. For generations, some believed these crossings were nothing more than lucky accidents, with people swept away by storms and carried to new shores. But that explanation began to fall apart. Archaeological evidence suggests that enough people arrived to establish thriving communities, something extremely unlikely if only a handful had drifted there by chance. Successful settlement required planning, cooperation, and, perhaps most importantly, the confidence that land awaited them ahead. Think about what that means. Someone had to persuade others to leave the safety of familiar ground. Families carried children, tools, food, and the hope that the unknown would offer a future instead of disaster. One wrong decision could have ended the entire expedition before it ever reached land. Their names have been lost forever, but their courage reshaped human history. Every generation that followed existed because someone was willing to trust a destination they couldn't yet see. And if ancient people could organize voyages across open water long before recorded history, perhaps their greatest strength wasn't extraordinary technology at all. Perhaps it was something far more powerful and far more human. The more researchers investigated ancient travel, the more they realized this wasn't just a human story. It was part of a much larger pattern woven throughout the natural world. Across continents and across millions of years, survival has often depended on one remarkable ability: the instinct to know when it's time to leave and where to go next. Every year, enormous herds of wildebeest cross the plains of East Africa, risking crocodile-filled rivers in search of fresh grass. Arctic terns travel from one end of the planet to the other, completing the longest migration of any known animal. Even tiny sea turtles, after spending years drifting across vast oceans, somehow return to the very beaches where their lives began. Each species uses different clues: magnetic fields, the stars, the position of the sun, familiar scents, or inherited instincts. But the goal is always the same: reach a place that offers a better chance of survival. Ancient humans shared that same challenge. The difference was that they couldn't rely on instinct alone. Every new environment demanded new decisions. A river that looked safe might hide deadly currents. A fertile valley could become a trap during winter. Success depended not only on observation but on learning, adapting, and passing that knowledge to others. History reveals the same pattern again and again. Long before written maps existed, people crossed the Sahara when it was greener, navigated the islands of the Pacific using stars and ocean swells, and later built trade routes stretching from Asia to Europe. Different civilizations, different landscapes. Yet the same determination to push beyond the horizon. Think about that for a moment. Humanity didn't spread across the world because one extraordinary generation discovered every route. It happened because countless generations added one new piece of knowledge to the last. But that raises an even deeper question. If experience and shared knowledge were so powerful, what happened when explorers reached places where no one had ever gone before? Of course, not every ancient journey followed a careful plan. History preserves a handful of exceptions that remind us just how unpredictable exploration could be. Sometimes, survival depended less on skill and more on sheer luck. One striking example comes from storms at sea. Even experienced coastal travelers could be blown far from familiar shores by powerful winds and currents. Some researchers believe that a small number of ancient voyages may have ended this way, carrying people to islands they never intended to reach. It sounds convincing at first, but here's the problem. Accidentally arriving somewhere is very different from building a lasting community there. Archaeological evidence shows that many distant islands were settled by enough people to establish stable populations, bringing tools, food, and practical knowledge with them. That points to planning, not chance. A storm might explain the first unexpected landings, but it cannot explain generations of successful settlement. There were also times when journeys simply failed. Climatic shifts turned familiar grasslands into deserts. Rivers changed course. Mountain passes became blocked by ice. Entire migration routes that had supported people for centuries suddenly disappeared, forcing communities to abandon paths their ancestors had trusted for generations. These exceptions reveal something important. Ancient humans weren't fearless adventurers who always knew the right direction. They made mistakes, faced disasters, and sometimes vanished without leaving more than a few scattered traces behind. Ironically, those failures make the successful journeys even more extraordinary. Because if so many expeditions ended in uncertainty, how did humanity eventually manage to reach nearly every corner of the planet? That final piece of the puzzle changes the entire story. By now, the question has changed completely. It was never just how ancient humans traveled long distances. The real mystery is how they kept succeeding when every journey carried the possibility of failure. The answer wasn't hidden in a single invention or extraordinary ability. It emerged from something far more powerful: the human capacity to combine memory, communication, curiosity, and cooperation into one survival system. Think about everything we've uncovered. They followed migrating animals when that made sense. They memorized landscapes through stories, songs, and landmarks. They observed the stars, the changing seasons, rivers, coastlines, and mountain passes. They learned from failed expeditions just as much as successful ones. Most importantly, they shared every lesson with the next generation instead of forcing each generation to start from nothing. That was the breakthrough. Unlike almost every other species, humans could inherit knowledge without inheriting experience. A child didn't need to survive a dangerous desert crossing to understand its risks. They could hear the story years before ever seeing the desert. Someone could learn where fresh water appeared after seasonal rains without discovering it personally. Every conversation around a campfire became a way of extending the memory of the entire community. Imagine the difference that made. One person discovers a safer river crossing. Another identifies a shortcut through the mountains. A third notices the stars always rise in the same pattern before winter arrives. Individually, those observations are small, but collected across hundreds of years, they become something extraordinary, a living map that grows more accurate with every generation. That's why humanity spread farther than any of our ancient relatives. We weren't necessarily the strongest, the fastest, or the best adapted to every environment. We became the species that could accumulate knowledge instead of constantly replacing it. In the end, ancient humans didn't conquer distance because they had perfect directions. They conquered it because every journey, every mistake, every story, and every discovery became part of a shared memory that stretched far beyond the lifetime of any single traveler. And perhaps that invisible map, carried not on paper but in human minds, was the greatest invention our ancestors ever created. Now, Return to that first morning. A small group stands at the edge of the unknown, staring across a landscape that seems to have no end. The distance ahead is just as vast, the dangers just as real, and the future just as uncertain. Yet they take the first step anyway. From where we stand today, it's tempting to imagine that those ancient travelers already knew where the journey would lead. They didn't. Every valley beyond the horizon held new questions. Every mountain could hide either safety or disaster. The world they crossed was not waiting to welcome them. It was waiting to test them. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of the story. Civilization wasn't built because humans eliminated uncertainty. It was built because they learned to carry hope further than fear. They transformed memories into maps, stories into survival, and curiosity into a force strong enough to pull entire generations toward places no one had ever seen. When you look at a map today, every road seems obvious, but every one of those paths began with someone willing to walk into the unknown without any promise of success. In many ways, that's still what it means to be human. Our greatest journeys have never started with certainty. They've always started with a single step beyond the horizon and the belief that there was something worth finding on the other side.